Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. But anyway, this week we are going to be talking about a serial killer case. A serial killer that you may not have actually heard of before. In fact, even I hadn't heard of this case until very recently. Today we are talking about Trevor Hardy, a man who was dubbed the Beast of Manchester due to the brutality of his crimes. However, over time he also became known as Britain's forgotten serial killer because he operated around the same time as Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, in the 1970s, and he was kind of overshadowed by Peter Sutcliffe because Trevor Hardy had 3 victims in total, whereas Sutcliffe had a lot more. He had 13 victims, I believe. So Sutcliffe really became the center of attention. He grabbed the media spotlight, which meant that Trevor Hardy and his crimes were almost overlooked or just unnoticed. But before we get into the case, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Luisa for sponsoring this section of the video. Luisa is a sustainable jewelry brand that creates beautiful and exceptional quality jewelry pieces that don't have the luxury markup. They are very fairly priced. And right now, Luisa actually has a Mother's Day sale on. Obviously, Mother's Day is coming up in May for a lot of you guys in other countries, including the US, where most of my audience are from actually. And if you're currently looking for a gift for your mother or the mother figure in your life, then I highly recommend you have a look at Luisa's stunning products. I'm sure you will find something that your mum will love. I recently gifted my wonderful mum the Michelle necklace set and the Michelle earrings to match. I can't lie, I was so nervous to give them to her because my mum can be quite picky when it comes to the jewelry that she wears, but she was so happy with them. I actually showed my mum the Luisa website afterwards and she was picking out so many other pieces on there that she would love. So I guess I know where I'm shopping for every Mother's Day going forward. And I also recently got a couple of pieces for myself because I couldn't resist. So I got this Rosa necklace, which has a little moon and a star on it. I absolutely love this. It's so dainty and pretty. I've worn it every single day since it arrived because I think this is the kind of necklace that just goes with anything you wear. I also got these hazel earrings, which are just so cute, and I think they go really well with the necklace. One of the reasons why I love Luisa is because they have such a wide range of beautiful pieces. They have a variety of necklaces, earrings, bracelets, rings, and their prices start at just $39. So there is something for everybody. As a brand, they are also committed to being carbon neutral. They offset 100% of the carbon emissions related to their product's life cycle, and they also have a 365-day warranty. So if you would like to treat your mum or yourself or anyone else in your life to some Luisa pieces, then you can go through my link in the description box to get 15% off all products during the Mother's Day sale. Once again, that's 15% off all products when you click my link in the description box. Just to let you know, the last day to guarantee standard shipping before Mother's Day, so the 9th of May, is the 5th of May for the US and the 3rd of May internationally. So just make sure if you do intend to pick up a few pieces for Mother's Day that you order them sooner rather than later to ensure that they arrive in time. Once again, a huge thank you to Luisa for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. And now let's just get into the case. So let's go back to the beginning. Trevor Joseph Hardy was born on the 11th of June 1949 45 in Newton Heath, which is an area in the city of Manchester in England. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find the names of Trevor's parents anywhere. However, I do know that Trevor was one of 4 children. He was the second youngest child. And again, I couldn't find the names of the 2 eldest children, but I know that the youngest was another boy called Colin. The Hardy family were quite a well-respected working class family. Trevor's mother would bring in some money by doing a couple of cleaning jobs. She worked really hard to provide for her family, and his father was described as being very straight-laced, so he was quite strict and he always wanted his children to be on their best behaviour, I guess. Now, I did read on a couple of sources that Trevor's father was an alcoholic and that when he would drink, he would become violent and he would mentally and physically abuse his family. However, as I said, I only read that on a few articles, so I can't be sure if that is true because it wasn't mentioned in any of the documentaries that I watched about this case, so take that bit of information with a pinch of salt. But anyway, back to Trevor. So he was never ever well behaved at all. Ever since he was a very young child, he was trouble both at home and in school. He never followed any rules. He would always argue and fight with people, and he was described as just being a bully. At school, he would bully and intimidate and be violent towards other kids, and the teachers would write to his mother and tell her that he was being horrible towards his peers. But to be honest, his mother was having the same issues with him at home. He was very disruptive and badly behaved. She really struggled to keep him under control and discipline him. In fact, it's even been suggested that Trevor's own family was scared of him. Even when he was a young child, like 8 years old, he was scary. He had such a violent temper. And Trevor's violent and aggressive behaviour really put a stigma on the Hardy family. His family received a really bad reputation because of him. In fact, his younger brother Colin said that he always suffered as a child because of his brother's reputation. Colin was never invited out to play with other children. He was never invited to children's parties because people knew of Trevor's character. Everyone in the local area knew Trevor Hardy and they knew that he was bad news. Trevor would constantly be in and out of Borstals and youth detention centres as a child, and when he was out of the Borstals, people suddenly decided to lock their doors. And I think that says a lot about just how bad Trevor Hardy was. The fact that adults are literally locking their doors because of a child, because they knew Trevor Hardy was about. Psychologists have since tried to work out why Trevor Hardy was so aggressive in his youth. Well, I say in his youth, but he was violent all throughout his life. Obviously, he was a serial killer. But they've tried to work out why this started in his childhood. What happened to him that led him to have such a violent temper at such a young age? And they've come up with a few things that they believe may have been contributing factors. The first is actually getting a younger sibling. Trevor was the youngest sibling for, I believe, quite a few years before his parents eventually had Colin, and Colin believed that Trevor was always jealous of that, jealous of him now being the youngest. You'll probably know this if you have younger siblings, but of course they are often given the most attention from parents because they are the youngest and they depend more on their parents. And Colin believes that Trevor really struggled to grasp this. When Colin came along, obviously the Hardy parents had to focus a lot on him because he was a baby. But Trevor hated that. He had been the baby of the family for years, but now he wasn't. And Trevor always held a bit of resentment towards Colin for this. He craved the attention that he used to get from his parents, the attention that Colin now received. So maybe that's why he would act out. Maybe that's why he would be violent and aggressive and bully other children, because then at least his parents would give him attention. But another thing that psychologists believe may have been a factor in Trevor's aggressive and violent tendencies was a head injury. At some point in his early years, when he was a very, very young child, he apparently suffered a blow to the head, which actually caused a slither of bone to break off his skull and press on his brain. And many people, including his own mother, believe that this incident changed Trevor. It had such a huge impact on his character and his behaviour. And as we know, that is something that we see often in serial killers. Many of them have suffered a head injury at some point in their lives, and Trevor Hardy is another to add to the list. As Trevor entered his teenage years, he started committing crimes such as petty theft and burglary. He used to break into people's houses and steal things, which is why people in the local area would lock their doors when he was out of youth detention centres. And when he was just 15 years old, he was actually arrested for these burglaries he was committing. He was charged with more than 20 separate offences and he was convicted. And despite his age, he was actually sent to a real prison for these crimes. He was ordered to serve 12 months in Strangeway prison, and he was the youngest person ever to be sent to prison at that time. But again, that just shows you how much of a danger the judge thought he was to the public. And as soon as he was locked up, people felt safe again. They felt safe enough to unlock their doors because Trevor Hardy was off the streets. Upon his release a year later, Trevor Hardy returned to Manchester. However, it's clear that his time in prison did not change him. It did not really have an impact on his violence. He was still the same aggressive guy he had always been, although now his aggression was also fueled by alcohol. He started drinking a lot when he was released from prison. He would often be seen down the local pubs and the working men clubs, and he soon became an alcoholic. And as I'm sure you can imagine, when Hardy drank, that only made him even more violent, and he would regularly get into heated arguments and fights with people in the pubs when he was drunk. The thing is though, Trevor Hardy wasn't even a big guy. He wasn't that tall, he wasn't big and bulky, he was quite a small man, to be honest, and yet people were still scared of him because they knew how quickly he could just snap. If someone made a joke that he didn't like, or if they made the smallest insult, he would lose it. He would just see red and he would get aggressive. He eventually got himself banned from most of the local pubs, but the ones that he wasn't banned from would literally just empty as soon as he walked in. As soon as people saw Trevor Hardy walk through those pub doors, they would instantly leave because they knew that he would cause a fight. And I'm sure that Trevor would have loved that. He would have loved being feared so much that people just fled as soon as they saw him. It was like being feared was more important to him than being liked. And soon enough, using his fists to fight wasn't enough for him. He started carrying a knife around with him, and on one occasion during an argument with another man, he got out this knife and he stabbed this man in the leg, and this stab wound almost severed an artery. From what I can gather, this man was okay. It wasn't a life-threatening injury that he sustained. However, the victim of Trevor's next attack would not be so lucky. One evening in early 1972, so when Hardy would have been around 26 years old, he was at the pub with his friend Stanley O'Brien, and they were drinking and having a good time until the two of them got into a heated argument about whose turn it was to pay for the next round of drinks. They both thought it was the other person's turn to buy the drinks. And Trevor Hardy got so angry with Stanley O'Brien that he actually went and got a pickaxe, returned to the pub, and attacked him with it. He attacked his friend with an axe over a round of drinks. axe. He hit him over the head with it repeatedly, and Stanley O'Brien's injuries were so severe that he was never able to work again, and eventually, not too long after that attack, he did die from his injuries, so Hardy was responsible for his death. Hardy was arrested immediately after the attack, and in February of 1972 he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for wounding with intent. And he spent his entire prison sentence just enraged. He was so furious with Stanley O'Brien, the guy that he had attacked, because to him it was his fault he was in prison. Trevor would just sit in his cell every single day thinking about how he was going to get revenge on Stanley for putting him inside, and he decided that the way he was going to get revenge was by killing Stanley. That was the only way Hardy would be satisfied. Hardy was released from prison in November of 1974 after serving about 2.5 years of his 5-year sentence. He was released early on parole, and as soon as he was released from prison, he was on a mission, and this mission was to find Stanley O'Brien and murder him. However, Stanley O'Brien was already dead by this point. Like I said, eventually he did pass away as a result of his injuries, and he had passed before Hardy was released. And this actually angered Hardy. It wasn't enough for him just knowing that Stanley had died from the injuries that he caused. He was angry that he couldn't be there when Stanley died. He was furious that he didn't get to see him take his last breaths, and he regretted that he didn't finish Stanley off that night in the pub. Now, going back a little bit, before Hardy was released, so whilst he was still in prison, he would actually write letters to a 14-year-old girl that he knew called Beverly Driver, and he really became obsessed with Beverly. He had a crush on her, on a child, and remember, by this point he was in his late 20s. Anyway, he had a sick crush on Beverly, and he was hoping that when he would eventually be released from prison, the two of them could start a relationship. However, Beverly didn't want a relationship with this man because of what he did to Stanley O'Brien, and she wrote a letter to Trevor Hardy saying that she didn't want to be with him, and that she basically didn't want anything to do with him anymore. She didn't want to hear from him, she didn't want to see him ever again. And this, of course, angered Trevor Hardy. So when he was released from prison, not only was he on a mission to kill Stanley, but his second target was going to be 14-year-old Beverly. He wanted her to die too because she turned him down. In fact, it's been reported that whilst he was on the train home to Manchester after just being released from prison, he kept muttering two names: Stanley O'Brien and Beverly Driver. As we know, he soon learned that O'Brien was already dead, and so he started looking for his other target, Beverly. On the 31st of December 1974, so New Year's Eve, he went to Beverly's house. However, she wasn't home at the time, and so he picked up an axe and he threw it through her window, and then he just left and he started walking the streets looking for her, and he was armed with a knife. Trevor had been drinking quite a lot that evening, so he was quite intoxicated, and whilst he was walking down one particular street, he spotted a young girl, and in his drunken state, Trevor mistook this young girl for Beverly Driver, but it wasn't Beverly. This young girl was actually 15-year-old Janet Leslie Stewart. Janet lived in an area called Harper Hay in Manchester. She was the Rose Queen at her local church, and she had a job at the Bellevue Entertainment Complex. And on the evening of the 31st of December 1974, she was on her way to a New Year's party in Newton Heath. Janet was dropped off not far from where the party was being held, and she she began walking the short distance to the event, and she was so happy and excited about this party, about New Year's. However, this excitement was short-lived when she was spotted by Trevor Hardy. Like I said, Hardy mistook Janet for Beverly Driver, and so as soon as he saw her, he decided to attack her. He grabbed Janet, got out his knife, and he stabbed her in the neck with it, and she died. And after she was dead, he took her body to a nearby clay pit in Newton Heath, and he buried her in a shallow grave. Of course, Janet never arrived at the party that evening, and she never returned home, and so her parents contacted the police and reported her as missing. The police started looking into her disappearance, and they were able to determine that she had no issues at home and no issues at work, so they couldn't identify any reason as to why she might have wanted to go missing, so they were pretty certain that she hadn't disappeared by choice. Her family was so desperate for information regarding Janet's whereabouts, and alongside the police, they appealed to the public, hoping that they would be able to help find her. They put posters with Janet's picture on in shop windows. The local press covered Janet's disappearance. However, all tips and leads from the community, from the public, ultimately just resulted in dead ends. The police didn't even know if Janet was still alive. They didn't think that she was. They believed that this was probably a murder inquiry, but they couldn't be certain of that because there was no evidence to suggest that Janet was dead. And soon days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and there was still no sign of Janet Leslie Stewart. And over time, her case started to go cold. The only person who knew what really happened to her and where she was her killer, Trevor Hardy. And sickeningly, he would actually return to the site where he buried her. He would go there on multiple occasions, but he wouldn't just visit the body, he would actually mutilate it whilst he was there. So he would take an axe with him and he would cut off body parts like her limbs, and I believe he even decapitated her. So he cut off her head and he disposed of it in a lake, and it's believed that he did this in an attempt to get rid of evidence. He thought that if he dismembered her, it would be more difficult to identify the remains if they were ever found. Less than a year after Trevor murdered Janet Leslie Stewart, he met a woman called Sheila Farrow. Sheila was about 10 years older than Hardy, and he actually described her as being kind of like a mother figure in his life, which is weird when you find out that the two of them actually began a relationship. But yeah, the two of them started dating and they fell in love, and at one point Hardy gave Sheila some jewelry as a gift. However, it turns out that this jewelry belonged to his murder victim, 15-year-old Janet Stewart. He took it off of her decomposing body when he went back to visit it, and he gave it to his new girlfriend. He had kept this jewelry as a trophy. It was something that would always act as a reminder of the horrific and brutal crime that he had committed. Eventually, Trevor and Sheila moved in together, and they would move quite often. I think they would move to different areas around Manchester. They would regularly go out drinking together, and they would often go to pubs and bars in the district of Moston in Manchester, which is where Hardy's next murder took place. It was the 20th of July 1975 when Hardy decided that he was going to kill again. His next victim was Wanda Scala. She was an 18-year-old girl who lived on Lightbone Road in Moston with her parents. Wanda worked as a barmaid in the local pub called the Lightbone Hotel, and that is exactly what she had been doing on the evening of the 20th of July. She was at work that evening, and then when her shift ended, she played a couple of games games of pool, and then eventually when it got to around midnight, she left the pub on her own and she began walking back home. And just like with his previous victim Janet, as Wanda was walking along a street, she was spotted by Trevor Hardy and he attacked her. However, this time he changed his method of killing. So his last victim, he killed her using a knife. However, this time he decided that he was going to hit this victim with a brick. It's believed Hardy struck Wanda from behind with this brick so she wouldn't have known what was coming, and he just kept hitting her repeatedly in the head with this brick. And I believe he also strangled her at one point, and according to a couple of sources, she was also sexually assaulted. And then once Wanda was dead, he decided to mutilate her body, and he did this by literally biting off her right nipple. And it's believed that he got this idea about biting a victim's nipple off from another murderer that he read a book about whilst in prison. This murderer was called Neville Heath, and he killed 2 women in the summer of 1946. Let me know in the comments if you would like to see a video about him, by the way, and I will add it to my list. But yeah, Neville killed 2 women in 1946, and he also chewed off the nipples of his victims. So it's believed that Hardy was inspired by him to do the same to one of his victims. After Hardy had killed Wanda Scala and bitten off her right nipple, he then proceeded to keep bashing in her face with the brick. Her face was so badly beaten to the point where her skull was shattered, and she was pretty much unrecognizable, which I think was what he wanted. He didn't want her to be easily identifiable. However, Hardy didn't stop there. He also gouged her eyes out of the sockets and he embedded them into her abdomen, and I'm not exactly sure how he did that, but he did. And then after this, he dragged her body onto a building site and he partially buried it underneath some cardboard and some bricks, and then he fled the scene. However, unlike his previous victim Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala was found pretty soon after her murder. Just the next morning, her body was discovered by a passerby who spotted 2 human legs sticking out from underneath a pile of bricks, and he called the police. When the police arrived at the scene and they removed the cardboard and the bricks, they found the dead body of a young female. She was lying on her back, her arms had been stretched out, and she was semi-naked. News of a body being found very quickly spread around the local area, and the police were soon able to identify the victim as being 18-year-old Wanda Scala, who had not returned home from work the previous evening. Not long after the body was found, the police appealed to the public and they urged anyone with any information about her murder to come forward. And they also told the public to be on the lookout for a couple of Wanda's belongings that had clearly been stolen by the killer. Hardy had once again stolen something from his victim to keep as a sick trophy. He took Wanda's handbag and also one of her shoes, although he later returned to the crime scene about 2 days after the murder and he dropped off this shoe and then he left. And this was clearly a way for him to taunt the police. This was all just a game to him and he was enjoying it. He was enjoying messing with the detectives. This was his way of saying to the police, I'm in control of this situation. Of course, the brutal murder of this innocent young girl was huge news around Manchester. Everyone had heard about it, everyone was talking about it, and this included Trevor Hardy. One day, not long after Wanda's body was found, Trevor and his younger brother Colin went for a drink together at a local pub. And as they were sat in the pub and they were having a drink, Trevor started bringing up the murder of Wanda Scala, which I don't think Colin really thought was too unusual at first because, like I said, most people were talking about it because they just couldn't believe that it happened. However, Colin soon noticed that Trevor just kept mentioning Wanda's murder. It was like it was all he wanted to talk about. And eventually Colin said to him, why do you keep talking about this murder? To which Trevor replied, I did it. But he hadn't confessed out of guilt or even excitement. Colin said he wasn't excited when he said it. It was literally like a normal conversation to him. He just said in a calm voice, I did it. Almost like he was bragging about it, because to him this was something to be proud of. And of course Colin was completely shocked by his brother's confession, and all he wanted to do was get up and leave the pub, but he knew that he couldn't do that. He couldn't just leave because he was terrified of his brother, and if his brother thought that there was a chance Colin might tell someone about this confession, who knows what he would have done to him. Maybe Colin would have suffered the same fate as Hardy's previous victims. So I think Colin just kind of acted as normal as he could, and then eventually he said that he was going to go back home. But Trevor wouldn't let him leave alone. He left with him, and the two of them went back to Colin's house. And I think at this point, Trevor could see that Colin was very taken aback by his confession to Wanda's murder, and he realised that he probably shouldn't have told him what he had done, and he decided that he needed to scare and threaten his brother to ensure that he wouldn't go to the police. And so as soon as they got back to Colin's house, Trevor started beating his younger brother up, and he beat him so badly that Colin actually fell unconscious. Once Colin was unconscious on the floor, he then ordered Colin's girlfriend, who had just witnessed this whole thing, he ordered her to make him beans on toast, which she did immediately because she was terrified of this man. And he sat there eating his beans on toast whilst his brother was absolutely battered on the floor. And then once Trevor had finished his meal, he got up and he left. Colin thankfully eventually woke up, and his girlfriend helped to treat his injuries, and the next morning the two of them decided to go to the police station and report the assault. And Colin also told the police whilst he was there that his brother had confessed to him the previous night that he was Wanda Scala's killer. So the police immediately arrested Trevor Hardy for the assault, and also on suspicion of the murder of Wanda Scala. And when the police looked into Hardy's background, they really thought he could have been the one responsible for this crime. This was a guy that had a string of previous convictions. He had a lengthy criminal record, and he was known to be a very, very violent man. So he definitely seemed capable of committing such a horrific murder. But despite this, when they questioned him, he denied it. He protested his innocence, and he claimed that he was not Wanda's killer. So with no confession, the police began trying to find any evidence that linked him to the crime. Now, when Wanda's body was found, scientists were actually able to obtain a sample of the killer's saliva from the bite mark where her nipple had been bitten off. And so when Hardy was arrested, the police took a sample of his saliva to test against the saliva sample they had of the murderer. And it was found through these tests that Trevor Hardy's saliva sample did match the killer's blood group, but that was all it could really tell them. Of course, these tests were being conducted in the 1970s when DNA and forensic science was not that great. So at this point, they couldn't positively identify Trevor Hardy as being the killer. All they could tell was that he had the same blood group as the killer, but that's not concrete proof that he was the one responsible. If anything, it's circumstantial evidence. It's not solid concrete evidence. Now, after this, I think Hardy could tell that the police were looking more into the bite mark on Wanda's body, trying to link him to the bite mark, and he realised that if they had a look at his teeth and they compared his teeth to the bite mark, they would see that it was a match, that his teeth were the ones that chewed off Wanda's nipple. And he knew that he had to do something to throw the police off of his scent. And so he somehow managed to get a nail file smuggled into his prison cell. And using this nail file, he filed down all of his teeth. And this would have been a very, very painful thing to do, but he knew that he had to do it. If he didn't and they took his dental impression, then they would be able to see that his teeth matched up perfectly with the bite mark on Wanda's body. So he filed his teeth down, and unbelievably it worked. When they took an impression of his teeth and compared it to the bite mark, experts were unable to make a conclusive match. The police also spoke to Hardy's girlfriend, Sheila Farrow, and she told them that Hardy was at home with her on the evening that Wanda was killed, which of course turned out to be a lie. He wasn't at home, but Sheila provided him with an alibi anyway, probably because she was scared of him. But this meant that the police had virtually nothing linking him to the crime. All they really had was that saliva sample, but like I said before, that was really just circumstantial evidence, if that. And they also had the statement from Trevor's brother Colin, in which he claimed that Trevor had confessed to him that he was the killer. But for all the police knew, Colin could have just been lying. The police were probably thinking that maybe Colin just said Trevor was the killer to get back at him for beating him up. They couldn't prove that he was telling the truth. And also, by Colin's own admission, the two of them were out having drinks in the pub at the time that Trevor confessed. So maybe he just said that he did it because he was drunk and that actually there was no truth in his confession. So with zero concrete evidence linking Trevor Hardy to the crime, he could not be charged with murder. The only thing he was charged with was the assault of his brother. However, he didn't even go to prison for that. He was just given a suspended prison sentence, so he was free, and I think he probably just had to do community service and stuff like that. So by this point, Trevor Hardy had gotten away with 2 murders, and now that he had been released from custody, he was free to strike again. But interestingly, before his next murder in December of 1975, Hardy's name and face was all over the local papers in Manchester, but not for the reason you might expect. He wasn't in the papers because of his violent crimes. He was actually in the papers because he was being praised for saving lives. Saving lives, not taking them. Basically, one day in December of 1975, a fire broke out at Hardy's neighbour's house, and Hardy actually went inside the property whilst it was on fire and he saved his neighbours. And everyone thought he was just so brave and courageous, and the press interviewed him and they put a photo of him in the newspaper. Everyone just thought Trevor Hardy was a hero. However, that was not the case. The police didn't figure this out until later, but it actually turns out that Hardy was the one that started that fire. I don't know why he started this fire. Maybe he had had an argument with the neighbours and he wanted to get revenge or something, or maybe he just wanted the attention. He wanted people to think that he was this brave hero, when in reality he was a cold-blooded killer. A couple of months after this fire, on the 5th of March 1976, Trevor's violent side emerged again when he assaulted a 21-year-old woman in a pub toilet. Hardy basically put his hand between this woman's leg and she tried to push him away. She resisted, which made him very, very angry, and so he put his hands around her throat and he began strangling her. And during this ordeal, this woman was in so much pain that she accidentally bit part of her tongue off. It's believed that Hardy did intend to kill her in that toilet. However, he was disturbed. I think someone else came into the toilet and so he ran, and thankfully the woman survived. The attack was reported to the police and the people at the pub were able to give a description of the perpetrator, although it wasn't until later, after his next murder in fact, that this attack was connected to Trevor Hardy, meaning that Trevor Hardy was still free to try again, and the next time he wouldn't be unsuccessful. people. Just a couple of days after he attacked that woman in the pub toilet, he killed for the third and it's believed final time. His next victim was Sharon Mossoff, a 17-year-old girl who lived in Failsworth, which is a town in Greater Manchester. On the evening of the 9th of March 1976, Sharon had attended an office party in Bolton, which is not too far from Failsworth. It's roughly a 25-minute drive. Anyway, Sharon went to this office party and then around midnight she rang her parents and she asked them which bus she should get to get home, and they told her that it was bus number 98. So she hung up the phone and she did eventually get on that bus, bus 98. However, the next morning when her parents woke up, they realised that Sharon's bed hadn't been slept in. She never arrived home because sadly when she got off the number 98 bus the previous night and she began walking home, she actually spotted Trevor Hardy. She was walking past her place of work, I believe, which was Marlborough Mill, when she noticed that a man, Trevor Hardy, was trying to break into the property using a screwdriver. And I believe Sharon may have confronted Hardy and told him to stop, but he decided to kill her instead. He began attacking Sharon. He stabbed her with the screwdriver and he beat her very badly around the head, and then he removed the tights that she was wearing and he strangled her to death using them. Just like he had done with the last victim, after Sharon was dead, he mutilated her body by chewing off one of her nipples, and then after this he chucked her body in the Rockdale Canal. After he dumped the body, Hardy just went back home. However, he later realised that he had made the same mistake he made during the last murder. He realised that he had left a bite mark on Sharon's body just like he had done with Wanda Scala's body, and that very nearly gave him away last time. If he hadn't filed down his teeth whilst he was in custody, he probably would have been charged with that murder and sent to prison for life, but he just got away with it because he filed his teeth down, so the experts couldn't match his teeth to the bite mark. But now he had bitten another victim and he was concerned about this new bite mark being used as evidence against him if he was ever caught for this. And so he decided to go back to the crime scene, dive into the canal and retrieve Sharon's body. And when he pulled her body out of the water, he scratched over the bite mark 64 times with a rivet from his jacket so that the police wouldn't be able to compare his teeth to this bite mark because he had scratched over it. After Sharon's murder, Hardy decided that he should probably lay low for a while, and so he went on the run. Meanwhile, the morning after Sharon was killed, her body was discovered in the canal by a passerby, and when the police pulled her out, they could tell that her body was pretty much frozen because the water in the canal was so cold. Sharon was naked when she was found, although the tights that had been used to strangle her were still wrapped tightly around her neck, and the clothes that she was wearing that night had been removed by her killer and thrown into the canal separately. Soon enough, Sharon's body was identified and the police launched another murder inquiry, and it didn't take the police long to make connections between Sharon's murder and the murder of 18-year-old Wanda Scala, who had died about 9 months earlier. The police noticed that there were a lot of similarities between the two cases. Both victims were young girls around the same age, both had been killed at night whilst they were on their way home, and both bodies had been mutilated. The killer had bitten off one of each of their nipples. So the police were convinced that the man who killed Wanda was also responsible for the murder of Sharon Mossoff. And as we know, Trevor Hardy was pretty much the main suspect in Wanda Scala's case, but he had to be released due to a lack of evidence. However, by this point, the police had identified Hardy as being the guy that assaulted and strangled that woman in the pub toilet on the evening of the 5th of March, so they knew that he was definitely capable of these horrific crimes. Had he not been disturbed whilst he was strangling that woman, he more than likely would have finished her off. He would have killed her. So he was a very strong suspect in these murder investigations by this time, and the police knew that they needed to arrest him before he struck again. The only problem was they had absolutely no idea where he was. Like I said earlier, he had gone on the run, probably because he realized that soon enough the police would make all of these connections between the attack on that woman in the pub toilets and the murders of Wanda and Sharon. So he fled. The police launched a manhunt investigation to try and track down Trevor Hardy before he killed again, and they did everything they could to try and find him, but they were really struggling, to be honest. There was absolutely no sign of him anywhere, and I think they really started to lose hope that they would ever find him, because it literally seemed as though he had just vanished into thin air. But then just a couple of weeks later, there seemed to be a breakthrough in this case. The police received a tip-off from a member of the public, and they said that Trevor Hardy's girlfriend, Sheila Farrow, had recently applied for welfare benefits at a job centre in Fellsworth. So the police tracked Sheila down and they put her under surveillance, hoping that she would lead them to Trevor Hardy. They watched her and they followed her constantly, and then one day in April of 1976, they followed her to a flat on Wellington Road in the town of Stockport in Manchester. And as soon as Sheila went inside that flat, the police surrounded the building, believing that there was a possibility that Hardy was inside. The police knocked on Sheila's door and she willingly let them inside her flat, and they began questioning her. They asked her if she had seen Trevor, does she know where he is? And Sheila just kept saying, no, sorry, I don't know where he is. However, as she was saying this, Sheila kept pointing her finger upwards like that. And when the police looked up at what she was pointing at, they noticed that there was a loft above her, or an attic for those of you who are American. So the police went up to this loft, they opened the little trap door, and inside they found Trevor Hardy. He had been hiding up there. So the officers just shouted up into the loft, can you come down please, Trevor? And he said, quote, I'll come down, but only if you don't hit me. Which is just insane to me. This is a man that has been so violent towards people, towards women mostly, all of his life, and yet he's scared of being hit in the face. But anyway, Trevor came out of the loft and he was arrested and taken into custody. And now that Trevor was behind bars, his girlfriend felt safe enough to come forward to the police and make a confession herself. Now, if you remember from earlier on in the video, when Hardy was first arrested on suspicion of the murder of Wanda Scala, Sheila told the police that Hardy was at home with her on the night that Wanda was killed. She gave him an alibi. But now in April of 1976, she confessed to the police that actually she had lied. He wasn't at home with her that evening. She actually had no idea where he was that night, but he wasn't with her. And she also told the police that he wasn't at home on the night that Sharon Mossoff was murdered either. I'm guessing that Sheila just lied for him because she was terrified of him. He probably threatened her and told her that if she didn't lie to the police, he would kill her too. But now that Sheila had recanted her earlier statement, Hardy didn't have an alibi anymore for the time of the murders, and the police were certain, now more than ever, that he was the killer. And so he was charged with 2 murders, with the murder of Wanda Scala and with the murder of Sharon Mossoff. Now, at first, Trevor Hardy denied being the killer. He denied being responsible for the 2 murders, which meant that the case was due to go to trial. But then, all of a sudden, in August of 1976, whilst he was locked away in Strangeways prison waiting for his trial, he decided to make a confession. He sat down with the detectives and he admitted that he was Wanda and Sharon's murderer. However, that wasn't all he confessed to. To the detective's shock, he also confessed to another murder, the murder of 15-year-old Janet Leslie Stewart. He said that she was his first victim and that he killed her on New Year's Eve in 1974. And the police just could not believe it when Hardy made this confession, because Janet's case had been unsolved for about 2 years by this point. They didn't even know for certain that she was dead because they had never found her body. They never found any trace of her. But now Trevor Hardy had admitted to being her killer, and he agreed to take the police to the place where he buried her. He took the police to the area in Newton Heath where he buried her, but of course, as we know, as we discussed earlier on in the video, he dismembered Janet's body and he decapitated her, so her body parts were scattered around. Eventually the police did recover most of her remains, what was left of her. Obviously by this point she would have been just a skeleton, but they found remains and they were identified as being Janet Leslie Stewart, and Hardy was charged with her murder too. So now that was 3 murders attributed to Trevor Hardy, and the police realised that they were dealing with a serial killer. But the police were initially confused as to why he had admitted to Janet's murder. He hadn't even gone to trial yet and he was already facing 2 murder charges, so why would he want to add another one to that? Had he never confessed to killing Janet, her remains likely would have never been found. He could have very easily gotten away with that one, but instead he decided to confess to it. And it's believed now that he did that, he confessed to Janet's murder simply because he was bored. He had been in prison for a couple of months by this point. He was still waiting for his trial and he wanted a bit of excitement in his life, and he wanted the control back. He wanted control of this situation, and also I think that he probably wanted the notoriety. He knew that this was it for him. He knew he was going to be spending the rest of his life in prison, so why not try to get as much attention as he can before he is sentenced? News of Trevor Hardy's confessions and charges quickly spread around Manchester, and the local newspaper gave him the nickname the Beast of Manchester because of how brutal and vicious his crimes were. He literally was like a beast. Now, despite Trevor Hardy's confessions, despite the fact that he had literally admitted to all 3 murders, when it got to his trial in April of 1977, he actually decided to plead not guilty. And it's believed that he did this because, once again, he was probably bored. This was all just a game to him. It was another way for him to play with the police, waste their time, and inflict even more pain on the victims' families. However, then, just 5 days into his trial, he decided to change his plea. He decided to plead guilty, but to manslaughter, on the grounds that he was insane, that he was very, very mentally ill. But the court didn't accept that plea, and in a fit of rage, Hardy decided to sack his legal team and instead chose to represent himself, to be his own defense, kind of like Ted Bundy. During the trial, 3 psychiatrists that had examined Hardy took to the stand, and all 3 of them said that although he did display some psychopathic tendencies, they did not believe he qualified for the manslaughter plea on the grounds that he was insane. They did not believe that he was severely mentally ill, so much so that he could not be held responsible for his crimes. They believed that Hardy was just plain evil. And so, of course, on the 2nd of May 1977, the jury found 31-year-old Trevor Hardy guilty on 3 counts of murder for the murders of Janet Leslie Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mossoff. Hardy was given 3 life sentences and an additional 5 years for the attack on that young woman in the pub toilet. Now, jumping forward 3 decades decades after Hardy was convicted, so after he had spent 30 years in prison, he actually tried to appeal his sentence. He was obviously hoping that it would be reduced now. However, Hardy had never shown any remorse or guilt whatsoever for the killings, and so his appeal was denied, and instead the judge insisted that he should be given a whole life tariff, meaning that he would never ever be released. He would die in prison. And in 2012, he did. On the 23rd of September 2012, 67-year-old Trevor Hardy collapsed in his cell at Wakefield Prison after suffering a heart attack. He was taken to a hospital for treatment, however 2 days later he died. He passed away after having served about 35 years in prison, and he was one of the longest serving prisoners in England and Wales. Many people believe that Hardy may have had more victims than the confirmed 3. In fact, one case in particular that people suspect Hardy could have been involved in was the murder of Dorothy Layden. She was a 17-year-old girl whose body was found on the 25th of April 1971, and she had been dumped behind a pub on Rockdale Road in Collyhurst in Manchester. She had been raped and beaten to death with a brick. Unfortunately, Dorothy's case soon went cold. The police never found her killer. However, when Trevor Hardy was apprehended years later, people started pointing the finger at him, but there was no solid evidence linking him to the crime, and he did not confess to it either, so he was never charged. Now, according to a couple of sources, the police pretty much ruled Hardy out as being Dorothy's killer around 2008 because a DNA sample was found on a piece of material near Dorothy's body when it was found, and the police believed that this DNA belonged to the killer. And when this DNA was tested against Trevor Hardy's DNA, it was not a match. So for that reason, the Greater Manchester Police did not believe he was responsible. However, people have argued that just because this DNA was not a match does not mean he wasn't the murderer, because, as I said, this DNA sample was found on a piece of material near Dorothy's body. It wasn't found on her body, so it's possible that this may not have even been the killer's DNA. But yeah, there has never been concrete evidence indicating that he was Dorothy's killer, so he was never convicted of that one, and Dorothy's case remains unsolved to this day. But let me know what you guys think about that one in the comments. Do you think that Trevor Hardy was the killer, or do you think it was someone else that has just never been found? And that is it for this case. That is the case of Trevor Hardy, the Beast of Manchester. It's not exactly known what Hardy's motive was for these murders. I don't think he ever really said. We can see that there was clearly a sexual element to it. They were sexually motivated killings, but I don't think that was his only motive. I think another factor that drove him to kill was just his violent character. It was almost like Hardy was obsessed with violence. I think he felt powerful when he knew that people were afraid of him. Even when he was a child, he liked to bully and beat up other children. He liked that people feared him. Like I said at the start of the video, as well as being known as the Beast of Manchester, he also over time became known as the Forgotten Serial Killer because he was overshadowed by Peter Sutcliffe, who also operated in the 1970s. His last murder occurred in 1980, and he had a lot more victims than Trevor Hardy. He killed 13 women, so his murder spree attracted more attention. He really grabbed the media spotlight, and so a lot of people weren't aware of Trevor Hardy and his crimes, which I'm sure he would have hated. I'm sure he would have loved the attention that Peter Sutcliffe had. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Do you think Hardy had more victims than the confirmed 3? let me know. Before I go, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Luisa once again for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can get 15% off all products in the Mother's Day sale when you go through my link in the description box. I would also like to give a special shout out to the lovely members of my Patreon page. Not only do my patrons help to support me and my channel, but they are also helping to support two incredible charities, as 20% of my Patreon pledges are split between the DNA Doe Project and Missing People UK every single month. The DNA Doe Project is an all-volunteer organisation that uses genetic genealogy to try and identify Jane and John Does, and Missing People UK is an independent charity that not only helps to find current missing people in the UK, but they also provide support to the families and friends of missing people. So thank you so much to my Patreon members. I really could not do what I do on this channel without the love and support from you guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, then the link is always in the description box of my videos. Thank you so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye guys!